Welcome to Miss Retro Reads, and we continue with The Dark Frigate. Chapter 20. A Prize for the Taking. "We shall see," said Captain Winterton, when he had listened to all of the tale that he would hear. He turned about. "Boy," he cried, "go speedily and send for Mr. Rance in to me." The boy departed in haste, and in a moment there entered a junior officer, who stared in frank curiosity at the three in the cabin. "Mr. Rance," said the captain, "go aloft in person to the main truck, and look about you sharply. Come back and report what you see." "Yea, yea, sir," the young man replied, and with that he was gone. The captain stood by the cabin window and frowned plainly. He had small confidence in the good faith of the prisoner, and regarded his story as at best an attempt to save himself at the expense of his friends. The gentleman of the humours, somewhat sobered by the captain's manner of grave concern, returned to his desk, but sat tapping his finger and watching Philip Marsham. It had instantly, of course, dawned upon the runaway boatswain that his peril was more serious than he had had reason earlier to believe, for supposing the unknown sail should in all truth be the Rose of Devon, and since she was cruising idly whereabouts, nothing was more probable. He stood between the devil, or, at all events, the devil's own emissary, Thomas Jordan, and a deeper sea than any ship has ever sailed, the sea upon which many a man with less plain evidence of piracy against him has embarked from a yardern with a hempen collar about his neck and a black cap over his eyes. Who, pray, would accept for a sober truth such a tale as any scoundrel would make of whole cloth to save himself from hanging? Despite all he could do or say, he now saw plainly he must stand convicted in their minds of being at the very least a spy sent to learn the state of affairs on board this tall ship in which he was now a prisoner. Then back to the cabin came young Mr. Rance, and very much excited did he appear. "Sir," he exclaimed, and stood in the door. "Tell your tale." "A ship lieth 2 cables lengths from the land on the far side of the point, and a boat hath set out from her, and is following the shore as if to reconnoitre." "Aha!" said the captain. "It is quite as I thought. No drums, mind you, nor trumpets, Mr. Rance. Call them into quarters by word of mouth. Make haste and put springs on the cables if there be time before the boat rounds the point. Bid the gunner make all preparations for action, and order a sharp watch kept. But order also that there be no sound or appearance of unusual activity. Send me a corporal and a file of men and the master." The gentleman at the desk chuckled. "Come, boy, clear the table," said the captain. The boy jumped and returned to his work. The master came first, but the corporal and his men were close at the master's heels. "Take this fellow to the gun-room, clap him into irons, and set a man to watch him. Yea, yea, come, fellow, march along." And thus, sending before them Boatswain Marsham, erstwhile of the Rose of Devon frigate, the corporal and his men departed from the cabin. There were guns on the right hand and the left, ordnance of size to sink the Rose of Devon with a broadside. There were sailor-men thronging between decks in numbers to appall the young prisoner, who came down among them nearly naked from his swim. Though no greater of burthen than the Rose of Devon, the ship was better armed and better manned, and all signs told of the stern discipline of men of war. The alternative that Phil Marsham faced, as he sat in shackles with no spirit to reply to the jibes of the sailors, and watched him, stripped to the waist and moving deftly among the guns, were not those a man would choose. If this old shipmates took this tall and handsome ship a blow on the head and a burial over the side was the kindest treatment he could expect of them. And if not, the gallows loomed beyond a court of admiralty. For hours the hum of voices went up and down the main decks, and for hours Boatswain Marsham sat with the bolts upon his legs and wrists, and saw the life of the ship go on around him. The men leapt here and there at a word, or lolled by their guns waiting for orders. The night wore on, and, nodding, Phil thought of the two ships, laying one on each side of the point of land, and by all appearances two quiet merchantmen. Yet one, he knew, to his sorrow, smelled devilishly of brimstone, and the other, in which he now sat a prisoner, though her ports were closed and her claws sheathed, was like some great tiger watching through half-shut eyes a bold, adventurous goat. As the night wore on, he dared hope that the reconnoitering boat had returned to her ship with the news that had sent her away in haste, whereby there was a chance that his tale might yet be taken for the truth that it was, and the longer he waited, the higher rose his hope, and with the better reason. But an hour or more after midnight, he heard men beginning to talk as if there was something new in the wind, and the nearest gunner put his ear to a cat-hole. "The dogs are out, I hear oars," he whispered. "Yea, though they are rowing softly, I swear I can hear oars." A hush came over the ship, and those below heard faintly a hail given on deck. Distant sounds came and went like whispers out of the sky. Then somewhere outside the ship a great shout arose, and one of the men at a starboard gun cried gleefully, with a round oath, "Verily they are bent on boarding us, lads." Their foolish audacity seasoned the term of all our weary waiting. "Hark, they are hailing," cried another. "Come, strike your flag. Have an end of all this talk," a distant voice called, whereat Philip Marsham, who knew the voice, thought that though their audacity cost him his life, it was in its own mad way superb. But a boat crashed against the ship. There was a burst of yelling, followed by a rattle of musketry. Then a voice boomed down, "Haul up your ports and run out your guns." At that the men beside the guns sprang up with running and calling, and the ports flew open, and the sounds from without became suddenly louder and clearer. On the other hand were boys handling up filled budge barrels. On the other were gunners with lint-stocks ready and powder for the priming. Then, "Ho, master gunner!" a great voice roared. "Withhold your fire! The boats are under the guns, and too near for a fair shot." It was such a moment as a man remembers always, for there was the smoke of powder in the air, with a din of splashing and cursing, and overhead a great hubbub, then silence save for the quick beat of the oars. "See, see!" cried the man. "There they go, splintering and all but sunk. And see, there go ours. To your oars, lads, to your oars, ere their ship hath time to flee. See, there they go, yea, and there we go." The old one had made his last blunder. He had come by night, thinking to board a peaceful merchant ship, laden with rich cargo, and had found himself at the head of his score of men on the deck of a man-of-war. To all those below, but most of all to Phil Marsham, chained in the gun-room, it was a blind, confusing affair. But the sounds told the story, and though darkness hid the blood that was spilled, there was no mistaking the cries for quarter and the shrieks of agony. Nor was there need for haste to reach the Rose of Devon, since the men left as keepers of the ship were too few to make sail. Captain Charles Winterton of the King's Navy himself boarded the Dark Frigate by starlight, and a capital lark he found it, for behind his stern main was a lively taste for such adventure. With lusty shouting, he swept the handful of men from her deck, and having put a prize crew and his lieutenant in charge of her, He brought back a few more prisoners to join company with the luckless boarders he had sent down to be locked in irons below. They were sad and angry gentlemen, for there are those to whom the laughter of 100 sailors is worse than the death by the sword. The first of them all to enter the gun-room was Tom Jordan. His cheek was gashed, and his hair was singed, and blood smeared his shirt from shoulder to shoulder, and one arm hung limp and broken. But though he was in great pain, he smiled, and when they led him into the gun-room, and he saw Philip Marsham, with bolts on wrists and ankles, he laughed aloud. The fellow was a very mark and pattern of a scoundrel, but he had the courage and spirit of a hero. And had he first gone to sea under another king than James or Charles, he might in some overwhelming danger have saved England. Great admirals are made of such timber, and bold, resolute, utterly dauntless, and any bold man might have fallen into the same trap that had caught Tom Jordan. Nay, had nothing warned Captain Winterton or aroused his suspicions, there was a fighting chance for Tom Jordan to have taken his ship from him even so. But Tom Jordan had gone to sea in the days when the navy was going to the dogs, and like many another lad of spirit who left the king's service to join the pirates, he had an adventure with the Algerians before he led the gentlemen of Bideford. And at last, hazarding a final effort to retrieve his luck, he had unwittingly thrust his head into the halter. Yet, though they had broken his body, they had failed to touch his courage. Despite his pain, he could smile and even laugh. Turning his great grief into a jest, he cried, "Holloa, O bravest of boatswain! This is a joy I had not looked for. It seems that, if hang I must, I shall not hang alone." And laughing again, right merrily, he swooned away, which Captain Charles Winterton, having himself come down with the others to see them all shackled, watched with quiet interest. They brought down the carpenter, who was shaking, and his beard waggled as he shook. They brought down Martin Barwick, whose face was drawn and haggard, and his hand rubbed his throat, for it itched, and in a prophetic manner. Then came Harry Malcolm, who stopped before Phil and spat at him and cursed him, and Paul Craig, who had neither eye nor thought for any one beside himself, and a dozen others of whom there was not one that failed to revile at their erstwhile boatswain. A hapless time of it Philip Marsham had among them, but it added little to his great burden of misery. Nor, for the matter of that, did reviling content them, for toward morning, when the others were dozing, Harry Malcolm, whom they had locked to a longer chain, crawled over to where Phil lay, and very craftily tried to kill him with bare hands. The guard cried out, but instead of stopping, the man redoubled his efforts to throttle the lad whom he had seized from behind when he was asleep, whereupon the guard struck a sharp blow with the butt of his musket, and when the corporal had come running and had felt of Harry Malcolm's wrist, and had listened to his heart, and had turned him over on his back, he cursed the guard with fluent oaths for robbing the gallows. Chapter 21. Words Come True. To the Isle of Wight, and whence the Spithead and Deptford came in time the Sybil of 44 guns, Captain Charles Winterton, and accompanying her in the hands of a prize crew, the Rose of Devon frigate. There bundling certain unhappy gentlemen of fortune out of the ship, they sent them expeditiously up to the London and deposited them for safe keeping in the Marshalsea prison, a notable hostelry which has harbored great rogues before and since. In the fullness of time, the Lord High Admiral of England, who holds his court of justice for trials of all sea causes for life and goods, being assisted by the Judge of Admiralty and sundry others, officers and advocates, and civilians, was moved to proceed against the aforesaid gentlemen of fortune. So they heard their names cried in the High Court of Admiralty, and were arraigned for piracy and robbery on the high seas, and charged with seizing the frigate Rose of Devon, the property of Thomas Ball, and others, murdering her master, Francis Candle, and stealing supplies and equipment to the value of £800. Nor was that the whole tale of charges, for it seemed that the Lords of Admiralty laid to the discredit of those particular gentlemen of fortune numerous earlier misdeeds of great daring and wickedness, and an attempt to take his Majesty's ship, Sybil, which had cost the lives of certain of his Majesty's seamen, and had occasioned his Majesty such grief and concern. He who read the indictment spoke in a loud and solemn voice, such as might of itself take a man think of his sins and fear judgment, but they were already cowed and fearful, save only the old one, who still held his head high and very scornfully smiled. The cook bent his head and shivered, and dared not look the jury in the face. The carpenter wept, and Martin Barwick was like a man struck dumb, and Paul Craig kept working his mouth and biting his lips. There was a great concourse of people, for who would not seize upon the chance to see a band of pirates? But a very poor show the pirates made, save the old one, for though they had talked much and often of their valor, and had represented themselves as tall fellows who feared nothing in life or death, they were now and for all time revealed as cowards to the marrow of their bones. Quietly, the officers of the court swore their first witness, who smelled of pitch and tar, and bore himself in such wise that he was to be known for a sailor wherever he might turn. To their questions he replied with easy assurance, for he was not one of those fellows who cope with great gales and storms at sea only to be cowed by a great person at land. Yea, sir, quoth he, there is among mariners common talk of a band of sea-sharks that hath long resorted to his Majesty's port of Bidford. Yea, my lord, and have I met them? That I have, and to my sorrow. This month 2 years I was master in a likely snow, the prosperous of 300 tons, which fell afoul of that very company, as their boasting and talk discovered to us, who took our ship, and set me adrift in a boat with 7 of mine own men, whereby, God being merciful unto us, we succeeded, after many hardships, in winning to the shore of Ireland, whence the grace of Bristol bore us home to England. The fate of the others in our company, in faith, some, I am told, joined themselves with the same band of sea-sharks. The rest were slaughtered out of hand. Nay, my lord, the night was black, and my sight of the scoundrels was brief. I much misdoubt if I should know them again. Come, come, quoth his lordship, tapping the papers spread on his table. Look at these prisoners gathered here at the bar, and tell me if there be one among them of whom you can say, this man was there, this man did thus and so. So the witness came, with the air of a man who is pleased to be seen of many people, and looked them over, one and all. But at the end of his looking he sadly shook his head. Nay, my lord, the night was dark, and the sight was uncertain. And though I should rejoice, none more than I, to see a pirate hanged, I am most loath to swear away the life of an innocent man. There is no man here of whom I can truly say I have seen him before. His lordship frowned, and the protractors shook their heads. The prisoners sighed and breathed more freely. The tale was at an end, and bearing away with him his smell of pitch and tar, the fellow returned to his place. 4 witnesses were then summoned, one after another, and told tales like the first. One had been in a ship that was seized and sunk in Bristol Channel. The second had received a gaping wound in the shoulder off St. David's Head, and had known no more until he found himself alone on the deck of a plundered flyboat. The third had fallen into evil company in Plymouth, which beat him and robbed him and left him for dead. And from the talk of his murderous companions he had learned before they set upon him that they were certain gentry of Bidford, and the last of the four told of the murderous attack of a boarding party, which had taken a brig and tumbled him over the side into a boat. Yea, my lord, he cried, and I fear to think upon what befell our captain's little son, for of all our crew only 3 men were left alive, and as they sailed away from us, 3, we heard the boys shrieking pitifully. One by one the witnesses wove their tales, a black net of wickedness, but they could not or would not say they knew this prisoner or that. The judge frowned darkly from his bench, and the people in the seats opened their mouths in wonder and excitement at the stories of robbery and murder. But the net was woven loosely and without knots, for thus far there had been no one to pick out this man or that and say, "It was he who did it." So the cook and the carpenter took heart, and the color returned to Martin Barwick's face, and the old one, leaning back, still smiled scornfully. Yet the judge and the advocates seemed in no way discouraged, from which the men of the Rose of Devon might have drawn certain conclusions. For, as all the world knows, judges and advocates with a band of pirates under the thumb are, for the honor of the law, set upon making an example of them. There was long counselling in whispers, then a bustle and a stir, and an officer cried loudly, "Come, make haste and lead her in." A murmur passed over the court, and the people turned their heads to look for the meaning of the cry. Then a door opened, and an officer appeared, leading by the arm a very old woman. Phil Marsham felt his heart leap up. He saw Martin raise his hand to his throat with a look of horror. But when he stole a glance at the old one, he saw, to his wonder, that the old one was smiling as calmly as before. Truly, the man was a marvel of unconcern, and a very cool and desperate rascal. "Is this the woman?" quoth my lord the judge, who raised his head and lifted his brows to see her the better. "Yea, my lord." Let us look into this matter." There was silence in the room except for the sound of shuffling papers. "This woman, commonly known as Mother Taylor, is to be hanged this day, I believe." "Yea, my lord." "And it hath been suggested that if she can lay before us such evidence as is needful, she will be commended to the king's mercy and doubtless reprieved from the gallows. Hath all this been made plain and clear to her?" "Yea, my lord." "It appears by these papers, woman, that keeping a house to which rogues of all description have resorted is the least of your crimes." A strange, cracked old voice burst shrilly upon the still court. "'Tis a lie, my lord. Alas, my lord, that wicked lie should take away my good name, I tottering on the edge of the grave." There were cries of silence, and the officer at the old woman's side shook her by the arm. "And to continue from the least to the greatest, you have disposed of all manner of stolen goods, and have prepared slow poisons to be sold at a great price, and have stained your hands with murder. Alas, my lord, it is a wicked lie." They shook her into silence, but her lips continued to move, and as she stood between the officers, her sharp little eyes ranged about the court. There was further counselling among the proctors, and then one cried sharply, "Come, old woman, remember that the hangman is ready to don his gown, and answer me truly before it is too late. On such and such a day you were at your house in Bidford, were you not?" "Nay, sir, I am old, and my wits are not all they were once, and I cannot remember as I ought." "Come now, on such a day, did not a certain man come to your house at Bidford, and abide there the night?" It may be, for one who keepeth a tavern hath many guests. Look about you, old woman. Tell us if you see the man. Nay, good sir, my wits wander, and I do not remember as I used to. As Philip Marsham watched her old face, so very old and crafty, he paid little heed to the low voices of the proctors and the judge, but the sharp command, "Look this man in the face and tell us if you have ever seen him before," came to the erstwhile boatswain of the Rose of Devon, like the shock of cold water on a man lying asleep. They led her before Tom Jordan, before the old one himself, and the two looked each other full in the face, yet neither fluttered an eye. In all truth, they were a cool pair. It had taken a Solomon to say which of them was now the subtler. "Nay, my lord, how should I know this man? He hath the look of an honest fellow, my lord, but I never saw him ere this." Whereupon the officers exchanged glances, and the proctors whispered together. They led her before Martin Barwick, and again she shook her head. "Nay, my lord, I know him not." But Martin was swallowing hard, as if some kind of pip had beset him, and this did not escape the notice of the court. Down the line of accused men she came, and though she walked in a shadow of the gallows, she said of each in her shrill, quivering old voice, "Nay, my lord, I know not him." Of some she spoke thus in all truth, of others, though she knew it would cost her life, she craftily and stoutly lied. And at last she came to Philip Marsham, whose heart chilled when he met the sharp eyes that had looked so hard into his own in Bidford long before. "Nay, my lord, he is a handsome blade, but I never saw him ere this." Some smiled and sniggered, but the old woman struggled and lifted her brows, and stood before the court, wrinkled and bent by years of wickedness. Say what you will of her sins, her courage and loyalty were worthy of a better cause. In despair of pinning her down, they led her away at last to a bench where she sat with the officers to guard her. Now she watched one man, and now she watched another. Often Philip Marsham felt a tremor, almost of fear, at seeing her eyes looking hard into his own. But though of the old woman the court had made nothing, the exultation that showed in the faces of some of the prisoners was premature, for the Lords of Admiralty had other shafts in their bow, as any gentleman of fortune might have known they would. Again there was a stir among the ushers, and in the door appeared one whose coming Tom Jordan ceased to smile. The fellow's chin sagged, and his eyes were wild, and he ducked to his lordship as if someone had pulled a string, and when they called on him to give the court his name, he cried very tremulously, Yea, Joseph Kirk, and it please you, me lord. Come now, look about you at these men who are arraigned for piracy. Are there any there whom you have seen elsewhere? Yea, that they be, there, and there, and there. Ah, men you have seen elsewhere. Tell us who they are. And his lordship smiled dryly. It is not to count against me, my lord. I have repented, yea, I have repented. 'Twill not undo the king's pardon. The very judge on the bench gave a grunt, as in disgust and of abject terror the fellow showed, and a murmur of impatience went through the room. But though he afforded a spectacle for contempt, they reassured him and urged him on. Yea, that one there, he at the end, was our captain, and Tom Jordan his name. It was he who led us against a vast number of prizes, which yielded rich profit. It was he and Harry Malcolm. Why, Harry Malcolm is not here. 'Tis passing strange. He hath so often stole beside them. I had thought he would hang beside them too. Yea, as I was saying, let us consider. Yea, it was he and Harry Malcolm who contrived the plan for killing Captain Candle and taking the Rose of Devon. Yea, they called me apart on the forecastle, and tempted me to sin, and forced me with many threats. He it was. Tom Jordan was on his feet. You lie in your throat, you drunken dog. It was you who struck him down with your own hand. Nay, I did him no harm. It was another. I swear it was another. It seems, said his lordship, when they had thrust Tom Jordan back to his seat, and had somewhat abated their witnesses' terror of his one-time chief, it seems this fellow's words have touched a sore. Go on. And there is Martin Barwick. Nay, hold him. Nay, if I am to go on, I must have protection. And there Paul Craig, and there our boatswain, Philip Marsham. And so he continued to name the men, and told a tale of shameful acts and crimes for the least of which a man is hanged. Indeed, Philip Marsham himself knew enough of this history to send them one and all to the gallows, and he had not heard a 10th part of the story of piracy and robbery and murder and black crimes unfit for the printed page that this renegade pirate told to the full court of admiralty. The fellow made a great story of it, yet kept within a bowshot of the truth. But he was a villain of mean spirit, and though he did for the court the work it desired, he bought his life at cost of whatever honor he may have had left. And then came Captain Charles Winterton, who rose bowing in his stately wise to his lordship, and with a composed air and an assured voice, very quietly drew tight the purse strings of the net that Joe Kirke had knotted. In his grand and dignified manner, he bowed now and then to his lordship and to the proctors, who asked him questions with a difference in their bearing very different from their way with the other witnesses. Yea, these pirate rogues boarded his Majesty's ship, Sybil, and killed 3 of his Majesty's men before they perceived the blunder they had made and gave themselves up. How many lives did the boarders lose? Probably 12 or 14. Several bodies fell into the water and were not recovered. It was useless to hunt for them, my lord. Great sharks abound in those waters. Yea, this Tom Jordan led them in prison. In truth, there is little distinction between them in the matter of guilt. The man Marsham, whom the previous witness named a boatswain, was the first to board the Sybil. He entered the great cabin by way of the stern, apparently to spy on the situation on board. He declared himself a forced man who had run away from the pirates. Who could say? The situation in which he was taken was such a certainty as to incriminate him, though 'twas cause for sorrow, since he was a brave lad and had given no trouble during the voyage home. There was a great whispering among the people, who thought it was a shame for so likely a lad to hang with a pack of pirates, but it was plain by now to the greatest dullard among whose unhappy gentlemen of fortune that hung they must. And for Philip Marsham, who sat as white as death from the shame of it, there was no slightest spark of hope. The net was woven and knotted and drawn, and the end of it all was at hand. When, according to the custom of the time, they called on Tom Jordan for his defense, he rose and said, Alas, my lord, the ropes are laid that shall hang me. Already my neck aches. This, though, I will say, whatever these poor men have done, it is I that compelled them into it, and I, my lord, will stand to answer for it. Some gave one defense and some another, and meanwhile there was much legal talk, dry and long, and hard to understand, and so at last they called on Philip Marsham to rise and speak for himself, if he had had anything to say in his own defense. He rose and stood before them, very white of face, and though his voice trembled, which was a thing to be expected since he saw before him a shameful death, he told them his true story, beginning with the day he sailed from Bidford, very much as I have told it here. But when they asked him about affairs on board the Rose of Devon, that concerned the others and not him, he replied that each man must tell his own tale, and that though he swung for it, he must leave the others to answer those questions for themselves. Come, quoth his lordship, leaning forward and sharply tapping his table. You have heard the question asked. Remember, young man, that you stand in a place exceedingly slippery. It shall profit you nothing to hold your peace. My lord, said he, the tale hath been told in full. There is no need that I add to it, and were I to speak further, I should but carry with me to the grave the thought that I had done a treacherous thing. Though I owe these men for naught save hard usage, yet have I eaten their bread and drunk their wine, and I will not, despite their sins, help to hang them. It was doubtless very wrong for him to reply thus, as any moralist will point out, since it is a man's duty to help enforce the law by bringing criminals to justice. But he answered according to his own conscience, and after the craven talk of Philip Kirk and the lad's frank and honest statement pleased perhaps even my lord the judge, sitting high above the court, who frowned because his position demanded frowns. Surely loyalty ranks high among the virtues, and great credit is due to a keen sense of personal honor. But there then came from his talk a result that neither he nor any other had foreseen. Up sprang Tom Jordan. My lord, he cried, I pray thee for leave to speak. To the frowns and chidings of the officers, who forced him down again, he paid no heed. A tumult rose in the room, for they had hurled the old one back and clapped hands over his mouth. But out of the struggling came again the cry, My lord, my lord! And his lordship, calling in a loud voice for order and silence, scowled and gave him the leave he asked. As Martin had said long before, Tom Jordan was an ugly customer, when his temper was up and hot, but no man to nurse a grudge. I thank you, my lord, said he, the while smoothing his coat, which had wrinkled sadly in the scuffle. Though I must hang, I desire to see justice done. It lay in the power of this Philip Marsham to have added to the tale of our sins and the sum of our woes. Wherefore, since he hath the spirit to refrain from doing thus, why, my lord, I needs must say that he hath spoken only the truth. He was a forced man, and having a liking for him, since he is a lad of spirit, I would have had him join us heart and soul. 'Tis true, likewise, that he ran away from our ship and turned his hand against us, and for that I would have let him hang with these other tall fellows, but for the brave spirit he hath shown. But as for yonder swine, yea, thou, Joe Kirk, quake and stare. He hath done more mean, filthy tricks to earn a hanging than any other gentleman of fortune, I believe, that ever sailed the seas. Not so, my lord, Joe Kirk yelled. He fears me for my knowledge of his deeds. Help! Hold him! Hold him! Tom Jordan swore a great oath, and Joe Kirk leapt up in his seat, white and shaking, and cried over and over that it was all a lie, and there was a merry time of it before the attendants restored peace. And then, to the further amazement of all in the court, Captain Charles Winterton again rose. If I may add a word, my lord. Thank you, my lord. I observed that when the prisoners went below, their manner towards this man Marsham was such as to lead a certain plausibility to his story. They took, in short, so vindictive a delight in his misfortune that even then it seemed not beyond reason that his tale was true, and that he had indeed left them without leave. That, of course, proves nothing with regard to his being a forced man, but it is a matter of common justice to say that in consideration of all that I have seen before and of that which I have this day heard, I believe he hath told the truth, both then and now. Thank you, my lord. Such a hullabaloo of talk as then burst forth among the spectators, and such a learned argument as passed between the proctors and the lieutenant of admiralty and his lordship the judge, surpass imagination. Some quoted the Latin and the Greek, while others, less learning, voiced their opinions in the vulgar tongue. So, not all in all, there was enough disputed to fuddle the wits of a mere layman by the time they gave the case to the jury. Then the jury, weighing all that had been said, put together its 12 heads, while such stillness prevailed in the court. Then a man could hear his neighbors breathing. It seemed to those whose lives were at stake that the deliberations took as many hours as in reality they took minutes. There are times when every grain of sand in the glass seems to loiter in falling, and to the drift through the air like thistledown, and if unwilling to come to rest with its fellows below. Yet the sand is falling as fast as ever, though a man whose life is weighing in the balance can scarcely believe it. So at last the jury made an end of its work, which, after all, had taken little enough time to consider of the matter they must decide. "You have reached with due faithful care a verdict in this matter," quoth his lordship. "We have, my lord." "You will then declare your verdict to the court." "Of these 14 prisoners at the bar of justice, my lord, we find one and all guilty of the felonies and piracy that are charged against them, save only one man." In the deathly silence that fell upon the room, the name sounded forth like the stroke of a bell. "We acquit my Lord Philip Marsham." There and then Philip Marsham parted company with the men of the Rose of Devon. His hand shook when he rose a free man, and when many spoke to him in all friendliness, he could find no voice to reply. Never again did he see their faces, but he heard long afterwards of how, a week from the day of the trial, they went down to the river to Wapping in the wherries, with the bright sun shining on the ships and on the shore, where a great throng had assembled to see them march together up the stairs to Execution Dock. Though they had always made themselves out to appear great and fierce men, yet on that last day they again showed themselves craven at heart, except Tom Jordan, the old one, stern, cold, shrewd, smiled at his fellows and said, "It is to be. My God have mercy on me." And though he stood with the black cap on his eyes and the noose round his neck, he never flinched. As for Martin Barwick, his face gray with fear, he strove to break away, and cried out in English and Spanish, and called on the Virgin, sadly though, and he fallen from the teachings of the church, and little did his cries avail him. He came at last to the end he had feared from the first, and his much talk of hanging was thus revealed to have been in a manner prophecy, although it sprang from no higher oracle than his own cowardly heart. One told Philip Marsham that Mother Taylor was hanged. Another said they let her go, to die a natural death in the shadows of the gallows that stood by the crossroads in her native town of Barnstable. Either tale is likely enough, and Phil never learned which was true. For aught I know to the contrary, she may have found an elixir of life as good as one discovered by the famous Count de Saint-Germain, and so be living still. Whatever the end she came to, Philip Marsham was far away when they determined her fate, for the day he stepped out in the streets of London a free man, once more and a loyal subject of the king, he took to the road to the distant inn. And we will continue this book next Friday or Saturday. And thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.